The sound of a dropped fork in the main dining hall of the obsidian room was usually enough to get a server fired, but tonight, the silence that followed the metallic clatter felt heavy enough to crush a man's lungs. Alara stood in the shadows near the kitchen swing doors, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed the front of her starched white shirt. The fabric felt rough against her skin, a constant reminder of the uniform that rendered her invisible to the city's elite. She adjusted the red vest that marked her as lower management's favorite scapegoat, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor tiles. The restaurant was a cathedral of glass and dark mahogany, suspended 50 floors above the city, designed to make the people inside feel like gods looking down on the insects below. Tonight, however, the gods were nervous. The air smelled of truffle oil, expensive cognac, and cold, sharp fear. Marcus, the floor manager, was currently turning a shade of purple that clashed violently with his silk tie. He gripped the shoulder of the young busboy who had dropped the fork, his fingers digging into the fabric. Marcus was a man who thrived on petty tyranny, a small king in a small kingdom, but tonight his cruelty was frantic. He hissed instructions that sounded more like prayers for survival. The entire staff knew who was coming. The reservation had simply read the family, but the security sweep that had occurred an hour prior told a different story. Men in suits that cost more than Alara's yearly rent had dismantled the floral arrangements to check for bugs and tasted the water in the pitchers. They weren't government agents. They moved with a predatory grace that the law didn't possess. Alara tried to shrink further into the alcove. She was 21, black, and trying desperately to remain a ghost in a room full of people who saw her only as a pair of hands to serve them. She needed this job. The tips were the only thing keeping the lights on in her studio apartment, and the anonymity usually suited her. But tonight, the atmosphere was charged with a static electricity that made the hair on her arms stand up. Alara, Marcus snapped, his voice a low whip crack across the service station. She flinched, stepping into the light. Stop lurking. Table 1 is empty. Fix the centerpiece. If a single petal is out of place when they walk in, I will ensure you never work in this city again. He didn't wait for an acknowledgement. He was already spinning around to berate the sommelier. Alara moved quickly, her rubber-soled shoes silent on the plush carpet. She reached table 1, the prime spot by the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the skyline. As she adjusted the white orchids, she saw the reflection in the glass before she heard the elevator doors slide open. They weren't just guests. They were a weather front moving in. A phalanx of men in dark suits poured out of the private lift, their eyes scanning the room with mechanical precision. And in the center of the formation walked a man who made the oxygen in the room feel scarce. He was young, perhaps late 20s, with a kind of devastating symmetry to his face that usually graced billboards, but his eyes were voids. Beside him walked an older woman, small and frail, yet she moved with a regal stiffness that suggested she was the steel spine of the operation. The arrival of the entourage sucked the air out of the room. Other diners, captains of industry and politicians, suddenly found their appetizers fascinating, refusing to look up. The unspoken rule of the city's underworld was in full effect. Do not see what you are not meant to see. The group moved toward table 1. Alara finished with the flowers and stepped back, pressing herself against a pillar, hoping to blend into the architecture. The man, the rumors called him Kong, the head of the syndicate that ran the ports, pulled out the chair for the older woman. His movements were fluid, practiced, and terrifyingly controlled. He didn't look at the staff. He didn't look at the view. He looked at the exits. The older woman, Madame Park, sat with a heavy sigh, her expression one of profound exhaustion and distaste. She looked at the gold-rimmed plate in front of her as if it were an insult. Marcus rushed forward, his oily charm dialed up to maximum. He bowed too low, his desperation leaking out of his pores. Welcome, Mr. Kong. Madam. It is the highest honor to have you at the Obsidian Room. We have prepared the chef's tasting menu, specifically curated for Kang raised a single hand. It wasn't a violent gesture, but it stopped Marcus mid-sentence as effectively as a gag. Water, Kong said. His voice was a low baritone, smooth, but devoid of warmth. And the menu. My mother wishes to choose for herself. Marcus nodded rapidly, looking like a bobblehead doll. Of course. Immediately. Pierre. He snapped his fingers at the senior waiter, a man who had served presidents. Pierre approached with the water pitcher, his hand shaking ever so slightly. It was a microscopic tremor, but in the high-stakes theater of this table, it was a scream. As Pierre poured the water into Madame Park's crystal goblet, the spout clinked against the rim. The sound rang out like a bell. Kang's head snapped toward the waiter. The movement was so fast it blurred. Pierre froze, the water spilling slightly onto the pristine white tablecloth. The silence that descended was absolute. Madame Park looked at the wet spot on the linen, then up at Pierre, her face unreadable but her eyes cold. Kong didn't speak. He just looked at the stain, then at Marcus. Marcus turned pale, his survival instinct kicking in, instantly looking for a sacrifice to throw to the wolves. His eyes darted around the room and landed on Alara. She felt the weight of his gaze and knew, with a sinking dread, that she was about to be fed to the lions. Pierre is unwell, Marcus stammered, grabbing the pitcher from the terrified man. Alara, take over. Now he shoved the heavy crystal pitcher into her hands, his nails digging into her wrist, pushing her out of the shadows and into the kill zone. Alara took the pitcher, the condensation cold against her palms. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her face remained a mask of professional neutrality. She had spent years perfecting the art of being blank, of hiding the intelligence and the history that lay behind her eyes. She walked toward the table. Every step felt like walking through deep water. The security detail watched her, their hands hovering near the lapels of their jackets. She could feel the heat of their scrutiny, assessing her as a threat. She was a curiosity to them, a young black woman in a high-end establishment, visibly out of place among the older, European staff, yet moving with a strange, grounded calm that contradicted her shaking hands. She reached the table and stopped. She didn't immediately pour. She waited. It was a subtle power play, or perhaps just hesitation, but it caught Kang's attention. He looked up at her, really looked at her, for the first time. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and utterly merciless. He was assessing her value, deciding whether she was competent or another annoyance to be removed. Alara lowered her gaze, not in submission, but in a specific kind of deference that felt archaic. She reached for a fresh napkin from her service tray and placed it over the wet spot on the tablecloth. Her movements were precise, efficient. Then, she picked up the pitcher. She didn't pour from the side. She moved to the specific angle that traditional etiquette dictated, shielding the spout with her other hand to prevent a splash, a gesture so old-fashioned and specific it belonged in a tea ceremony, not a modern steakhouse. Madame Park watched her hands. The older woman's eyes narrowed. She was dressed in a modernized hanbok made of dark silk, her fingers adorned with jade rings that looked heavy enough to break bone. She looked tired, her skin papery and pale. She muttered something under her breath, a complaint about the coldness of the room, the pretension of the food, the distance from home. It was spoken in a dialect so rapid and mumbled that no one in the restaurant, not even Marcus, would have caught it. It was a private misery voiced aloud. Alara froze for a fraction of a second. She knew that sound. It wasn't just the language, it was the specific cadence, the clipped vowels of a specific district in Seoul, a place of old money and older secrets. A place Alara hadn't seen since she was a child, a memory buried under layers of foster homes and survival in a new country. The water filled the glass without a sound. Alara set the pitcher down. She should have retreated. She should have walked away and let Marcus handle the order. But she saw the way Madame Park was rubbing her temple, the way her hand trembled as she reached for the menu. It was a tremor of fatigue, of a woman surrounded by wolves, even if one of them was her son. The isolation radiating from the matriarch pierced Alara's armor. Without thinking, or perhaps thinking for the first time in years, Elara stepped closer. She didn't look at Kong. She looked directly at the mother. The security guards tensed, one of them taking a half step forward, interpreting her proximity as a threat. Kang's hand twitched on the table, a warning. Elara ignored the danger. She bowed. It wasn't the shallow, waist-hinged bow of the restaurant staff. It was a deep, slow inclination of the upper body, hands folded in a precise configuration over her stomach. When she straightened, she kept her eyes lowered to the level of Madame Park's jade rings. She opened her mouth, and the words that came out were not English. They were not the clumsy, tourist phrasebook attempts that foreigners usually made. She spoke in the exact, rare dialect of the Northern District. She didn't ask for the order. She greeted the woman with a phrase that acknowledged her status, her age, and the specific burden of her lineage, a greeting that was less about hello and more about recognizing the weight of the soul before her. The wind is cold this high up, grandmother, Elara said, the foreign syllables rolling off her tongue with a native fluency that defied her appearance. May I bring you something warm to settle the stomach before the wine touches your lips? The silence that followed was different from the earlier fear. This was the silence of a bomb that had landed but hadn't detonated. The air in the room seemed to crystallize. Marcus dropped his reservation tablet. It clattered loudly, but no one looked at him. Every eye at the table was fixed on the waitress in the cheap red vest. The security guards looked confused, their hands freezing halfway to their weapons, unsure how to categorize a threat that spoke with the voice of their childhoods. Madame Park's menu slipped from her fingers and hit the table. Her mouth opened slightly, her composure cracking. She stared at Elara, her eyes wide, searching the young woman's face for a trick, a wire, a joke. But the accent was perfect. It was flawless. It carried the specific emotional resonance of home. It was the sound of a hearth in winter, a sound that didn't belong in a cold tower of glass and steel. Madame Park's hand trembled violently now, not from age, but from the shock of recognition. She reached out, her fingers hovering in the air as if trying to touch a ghost. You, she whispered, her voice cracking, switching to English, but retaining the heavy, emotional cadence of her mother tongue. How? How do you speak the tongue of the old house? Before Elara could answer, the atmosphere in the room shifted from stunned silence to lethal hostility. Kong didn't share his mother's nostalgia. To a man who lived by the sword, a coincidence this specific was never just a coincidence. It was a trap. The sound of a chair scraping against the floor was the only warning. Kong was on his feet, his movement blurring with kinetic energy. In a heartbeat, he had closed the distance between them. His hand, large and manicured, wrapped around Elara's upper arm. It wasn't a caress, it was a vice grip, testing the bone. The security detail unholstered their weapons, the clicks of safety catches disengaging echoing like gunshots in the quiet room. Who sent you? Kang's voice was a low growl, stripped of all veneer of civilization. He pulled Elara closer, invading her personal space, his dark eyes searching hers for a wire, a camera, or the dilation of pupils that would betray a lie. A waitress in a Western steakhouse does not speak the dialect of the Northern District. That dialect is dead. It belongs to ghosts and the families who buried them. Who are you working for? The Triad? The Syndicate? Elara didn't flinch. She couldn't. The grip on her arm was bruising, but she had spent a lifetime being pushed around by systems and people bigger than her. Fear was a familiar landscape. She knew how to navigate it. She looked directly into Kang's eyes, seeing not just the killer, but the terrified son protecting his mother. No one sent me, she said, her voice steady, dropping the submissive waitress act. And if you break my arm, your mother doesn't get her tea. It was a reckless thing to say, a challenge thrown in the face of a predator, but it worked. Kang blinked, the absurdity of the threat momentarily short-circuiting his rage. Madame Park slammed her hand on the table, the jade rings cracking against the wood. Let her go, she commanded, her voice regaining the steel of a matriarch. Sit down, Kong. You are frightening the girl. And you are embarrassing me. Kang hesitated, the muscles in his jaw working. He looked from his mother to Alara, weighing the risk. Slowly, with agonizing reluctance, he released Alara's arm. He didn't apologize. He simply stepped back, smoothing his suit jacket, his eyes never leaving her face. One wrong move, he said softly, the threat hanging in the air like smoke. One mistake, and you won't make it to the kitchen. Alara rubbed her arm, feeling the heat of his hand still lingering on her skin. She turned to Madam Park and bowed again, deeper this time. I will return with the barley tea, madam. It is not on the menu, but I have a stash in my locker. For my own breaks, she turned and walked away, her back straight. She could feel Kang's gaze burning a hole between her shoulder blades, a laser sight tracking her every step. The restaurant remained silent, the other diners terrified to chew, witnessing a drama they couldn't comprehend but knew was dangerous. The kitchen was a chaotic sanctuary of steam and shouting, a stark contrast to the mausoleum quiet of the dining room. Alara moved through the line cooks like a phantom, ignoring their curious glances. She went straight to her locker in the back, her hands shaking only now that she was out of sight. She retrieved the small, sealed jar of roasted barley she kept for herself, a comfort from a past she usually tried to forget. As she prepared the tea, using a ceramic pot she had to steal from the prep station, Marcus cornered her. He looked like a man having a stroke. Sweat beaded on his upper lip, and his eyes were wide with panic. What did you do? He hissed, grabbing her shoulder. The security detail is blocking the doors. No one can leave. They said the waitress is a person of interest. Who are you, Alara? You told me you were from Ohio. Alara shrugged his hand off, her patience for his petty tyranny evaporated by the adrenaline coursing through her veins. I am from Ohio, she said, pouring the boiling water over the grains. The nutty, earthy scent filled the small space, smelling like home and heartache. But before Ohio, I was somewhere else. And right now, Marcus, unless you want that man out there to dismantle this restaurant brick by brick, you will get out of my way. She placed the teapot on a silver tray, adding 2 small porcelain cups. And don't send Pierre back to the table. He smells like fear. They'll kill him just for shaking. Marcus stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He had bullied her for 2 years, seeing only a shy, desperate girl. Now he was looking at a stranger who gave orders to Mafia dons. He stepped aside, shrinking against the stainless steel counter. Alara walked back out onto the floor. The atmosphere had changed. The tension hadn't dissipated. It had transformed into a heavy, expectant gravity centered on table 1. The other guests had been subtly encouraged to leave by the security team. The room was now empty save for the entourage. Kang was sitting down, but his body was coiled, ready to spring. Madam Park was watching the kitchen door, her expression one of painful hope. When Alara set the tray down, the sound of the ceramic touching the wood was the only noise in the world. She poured the tea. The steam rose in a curling ribbon, carrying the scent of roasted grain. It was a humble smell, completely at odds with the truffle and wagyu scents of the restaurant, but Madam Park closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, a look of pure transport on her face. My nurse. When I was a girl, Madam Park said softly, opening her eyes to look at Alara. She was from the South, but she learned the Northern way from my father. She had dark skin, like you. An American soldier's daughter, she took the cup, her hands steadying as the warmth seeped into her bones. She taught me that language is not just words. It is a rhythm. Where did you learn the rhythm, child? Alara stood at attention, her hands clasped. I was adopted, she said, the truth feeling heavy on her tongue. By a family in the Northern District. They were traditional, strict. They believed that to live in their house, I had to become them. I lived there until I was 12. Then the fire happened. She left it at that. The fire. The reason she was in America. The reason she was alone. Kong watched her, his expression shifting from hostility to a dark, brooding curiosity. He took the second cup Alara offered. Their fingers brushed. A spark, static and sharp, jumped between them. He didn't pull away this time. He took a sip, grimacing slightly at the bitterness, but he drank it. You survived the fire, he stated, not asking. The fire that took the Cho family estate. 10 years ago, Alara froze. He knew the history. Of course he did. He was the king of the city. He knew the history of every ashes pile in the underworld. I survived, she said simply. I learned to be invisible. It's safer that way, Kong set the cup down. Invisibility is a tool, he said, his voice lower, intimate. But tonight, you stepped into the light. You cannot go back to the shadows now. You know that, don't you? The meal proceeded with a surreal normalcy. Ilara served the courses, the wagyu, the caviar, the foam-topped heavy soups, but the food was secondary. The real meal was the conversation happening in the silences. Madame Park spoke to Ilara in the dialect, asking about her life, her struggles, ignoring her son's brooding silence. It was as if she had found a long-lost granddaughter. But the danger was still prowling the perimeter. Ilara's instincts, honed by years of walking on eggshells in a foreign land and then in the foster system, were screaming. Something was wrong. It wasn't the men in the room. It was something missing. She scanned the floor. The busboy, the one Marcus had yelled at earlier, was gone. In his place was a new face, a man with a scar on his neck, polishing glasses at the bar with a rag that looked too clean. Ilara was clearing the appetizer plates when she saw it. The reflection in the darkened window. The new busboy wasn't polishing a glass. He was watching the reflection of table 1. His hand was under the bar counter, reaching for something taped beneath the marble. It was a classic setup. The shift change. The distraction of the VIPs. Ilara's heart slammed against her ribs. She looked at Kong. He was distracted, listening to his mother recount a story about the old country. He was looking at his mother with a rare softness, his guard down for the first time in the evening. The assassin at the bar began to move, pulling a dark, metallic object from beneath the counter. It wasn't a gun, it was a compact, suppressed submachine pistol. There was no time to explain. No time to use the polite, formal dialect. Ilara dropped the stack of plates she was holding. The crash was catastrophic, the sound of shattering porcelain exploding through the room like a grenade. Down, she screamed, not in Korean, but in raw, American English. She didn't wait for them to react. She threw herself forward, not away from the danger, but across the table. She shoved Madame Park's chair violently to the side, sending the frail woman toppling onto the thick carpet just as the air filled with the angry hornet buzz of suppressed gunfire. Bullets shredded the tablecloth where Madame Park had been sitting a second ago. Crystal shattered. The orchids disintegrated into white confetti. Kong moved instantly, flipping the heavy oak table on its side to create a barricade, dragging Ilara behind it. The security detail returned fire, their loud, unsuppressed handguns roaring in the enclosed space. The assassin at the bar was cut down in seconds, but the damage to the room was absolute. Chaos reigned. Smoke, dust, and the smell of cordite replaced the aroma of fine dining. Ilara lay on the floor, panting, a shard of porcelain embedded in her vest. She was alive. Madame Park was alive, huddled next to her, praying rapidly in the dialect. Kong crouched over them, a gun in his hand that had appeared from nowhere. He wasn't looking at the dead assassin. He was looking at Ilara. His face was a mask of shock and calculation. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. He looked at the overturned table, the shattered remnants of the meal, and finally at the woman who had moved faster than his own trained security detail. The room was deathly quiet again, save for the groans of the dying gunman near the bar and the distant wail of approaching sirens. Kung holstered his weapon, the movement smooth and practiced, and extended a hand toward Ilara. It was the same hand that had threatened to break her arm minutes ago, but now the gesture was different. It was an offering. It was an acknowledgement of a peer. Ilara stared at the hand. Her ears were ringing from the gunshots. She looked down at her uniform. The white shirt was stained with wine and dust, the cheap polyester vest torn at the shoulder. She was a mess, but she had never felt more awake. She took Kang's hand. He pulled her up with effortless strength, steadying her when she swayed on her feet. Madame Park was already being helped up by the surviving guards, her face pale, but her eyes burning with a fierce, protective light as she looked at Alara. "You saw him," Kang said, his voice low, cutting through the haze of the room. "You saw the reflection before he even drew the weapon. My men were watching the doors. You were watching the room." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation of competence. In Kang's world, competence was the most dangerous currency one could hold. Alara brushed the dust from her skirt, her hands trembling slightly now that the immediate threat was over. "I told you," she said, her voice raspy. "I learned to be invisible. When you are invisible, you learn to watch everything. You have to, just to survive." She looked toward the kitchen. Marcus was peeking out from behind the swing doors, his face a mask of abject terror. He looked at the destruction, then at Alara standing next to the most dangerous man in the city. He didn't come out to yell. He retreated, letting the door swing shut, disappearing into the irrelevance he deserved. "You cannot stay here," Madame Park said, her voice shaky but commanding. She stepped forward, ignoring the glass crunching under her silk shoes. She reached out and took Alara's hands in hers. The older woman's grip was surprisingly strong. "They will know you helped us. The people who sent that man. They do not leave loose ends. You are part of the story now, child. Whether you want to be or not." Kang nodded, his expression grim. "My mother is right. You saved the life of the head of the family. That puts a mark on you. You can go back to your apartment, wait for them to find you, and disappear for real. Or you can finish what you started." Alara looked around the ruined restaurant. The obsidian room, once a temple of exclusion and wealth, was now just a crime scene. Her job was gone. Her anonymity was shattered. The shy waitress was a fiction that had just been violently rewritten. She looked at Kang. The tension between them had shifted from predator and prey to something far more complex, a recognition of shared scars. "I don't have a passport," Alara said, a practical objection to an insane situation. "I don't have money. I have a cat named Miso and a rent payment due on Tuesday." Kang actually smiled. It was a terrifying, jagged thing, but it was a smile. "We can handle the rent," he said dryly. "And the cat. But we are leaving now. The police are 5 minutes away, and I have no intention of answering their questions tonight." He turned toward the private service elevator, the one reserved for high-profile exits. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He knew she would. There was no going back to the table to pour water. The pitcher was broken. The water was spilled. Alara took a breath, smelling the cordite and the truffles one last time, and followed them. The descent in the private elevator was silent, but the air was thick with unspoken promises. The mirrored walls reflected a strange trio: the matriarch in her ruined silk hanbok, the crime lord in his dusty bespoke suit, and the waitress in her torn uniform. Alara watched her own reflection. She looked different. It wasn't just the dishevelment. Her posture had changed. The slump of the shoulders she had adopted to appear smaller, less threatening, was gone. She stood straight, her chin up, matching the regal bearing of the woman beside her. Madame Park still held Alara's hand, refusing to let go, as if Alara were a talisman against the violence of the world. When the doors opened, they weren't in the lobby. They were in the underground garage, a concrete bunker filled with the smell of gasoline and cold dampness. A convoy of black armored SUVs was waiting, engines idling with a low, predatory rumble. Men in suits opened the doors with military precision. This was the machine of the underworld, efficient and untouchable. Kang stopped at the open door of the lead vehicle. He turned to Alara. The harsh fluorescent lights of the garage cast deep shadows on his face, making him look like a carved statue of a guardian demon. "You speak the dialect of the north," Kang said, his voice echoing slightly in the concrete cavern. "You have the eyes of a soldier and the hands of a servant. It is a dangerous combination." My mother needs a companion who understands the old ways. I need someone who can see the reflections in the glass." He paused, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "This is not a job offer, Alara. It is an abduction into a higher tax bracket. If you get in this car, the waitress is dead. You understand?" Alara looked at the red vest she was wearing. It was a symbol of her servitude, of her silence. Slowly, deliberately, she unbuttoned it. She slipped it off her shoulders, letting it fall to the oil-stained concrete floor. It landed in a heap, a piece of red fabric that meant nothing anymore. She was wearing just her white shirt now, stark and simple. She felt exposed, but also armored in a new way. She looked at the vest on the floor, then up at Kong. "The waitress died upstairs," she said, her voice devoid of fear. She was bad at her job anyway. She always spilled the water. Madam Park let out a short, sharp laugh, clapping her hands together in delight. "Get in, child," she commanded, patting the leather seat beside her. "We have much to discuss." "And I am still cold." Alara stepped into the car. The interior smelled of expensive leather and safety. As she sat down, the door closed with a heavy, final thud, sealing out the noise of the sirens that were just now arriving at the front of the building. The convoy began to move, rolling out of the garage and into the city night. Alara watched the city pass by through the tinted, bulletproof glass. The streets she had walked as a ghost were now framed like a movie she was watching from a distance. She saw people rushing to work, people waiting for buses, people living the small, safe lives she had tried so hard to emulate. She realized now that the safety had always been an illusion. The wolf was always at the door. The only difference was whether you were the sheep waiting to be eaten or the one holding the leash. She felt a weight settle on her shoulder. Madam Park had rested her head there, exhausted, finally allowing herself to sleep now that she was safe. Across from them, Kong watched Alara. He didn't speak. He pulled a silver flask from his jacket, took a sip, and offered it to her. It was a gesture of equality. A truce. A beginning. Alara took the flask. The metal was warm from his hand. She took a sip. It was whiskey, sharp and burning, a fire to match the one that had destroyed her childhood home, the fire that had forged her in the first place.